She appeared at my door, frozen and silent. The message burned into her skin said, "Help me." Elias Varn was not a man who liked surprises. At 38, he'd spent enough years elbow-deep in the thermal relays of Nebula 4 atmospheric grid to know that surprises meant breakdowns, and breakdowns meant someone was going to have a very bad day. Usually him. So he'd made his life small, contained, and predictable, tucked away in a decommissioned storage pod in the frostbitten ascend of Grid 7D, a sector of the orbital station so forgotten it might as well have been jettisoned into the void. Grid 7D was a graveyard of rusted conduits and collapsed relay hubs, buried under ice and ash for most of the station's 280-day cycle. Nobody came here to visit. Nobody came here for anything unless they were looking to disappear. Elias, being a man of practical habits, liked it just fine that way. He'd been a conduit engineer once, crawling through the station's guts, patching leaks and rerouting heat flows to keep the air breathable. It was good work, necessary work, but it came with too many eyes, too many questions, too many forms to file. So he'd taken a maintenance post, the kind where you checked boxes, sent metrics, and nobody bothered you as long as the numbers looked right. He filed his reports remotely, kept his comms off, and let the world forget him. His pod, a squat, reinforced box welded to the ruins of a tram relay hub, was his fortress. It wasn't cozy, but it was his. Inside, the air smelled of recycled coolant and burnt protein paste. The walls were patched with insulation foam, and the light came from a salvaged strip that buzzed faintly when the power cycled. Elias kept it dim to save juice, just enough to see his tools, a clutter of thermal cables, solder nodes, and a half-disassembled plasma coil he'd scavenged from a scrapped drone. His life was quiet, deliberate, and as close to invisible as you could get without actually being dead, which is why when the knock came he damn near dropped the coil he was tinkering with. It was 02:17 station time, and the storm outside was a screamer. The monitor on his workbench blinked red, -62 degrees C, winds at 140 clicks per hour and climbing. Snow and ash battered the pod's outer hull, a constant hiss that drowned out the hum of the heater core. Nobody could be out there. Nobody sane anyway. Elias stood, wiping his hands on his grease-stained jumpsuit, and stared at the sealed hatch. His first thought was a loose panel, maybe a sensor dislodged by the wind, smacking against the frame. He'd seen it before, storms kicking up debris that mimicked intent. But then it came again. Knock, knock, slow, deliberate, not the random clatter of metal. His pulse ticked up, not out of fear, but from the sheer wrongness of it. People didn't knock in Grid 7D. People didn't come here, period. He crossed the pod in 3 strides, his boots scuffing the insulated mat that kept the floor from freezing his toes off. The hatch was a slab of reinforced alloy, its pressure seal rated for vacuum exposure, though Elias had never tested that claim. He stood there, one hand hovering over the release switch, his mind running through every protocol he'd ever memorized. Breach scenarios, containment failures, rogue drones. None of them fit. The knock came again, fainter this time, like whoever was out there was losing strength. Elias cursed under his breath, a habit he'd picked up from years of working alone. He hit the switch. The seal hissed, retracting with a groan, and a wall of cold slammed into him, carrying snow, ash, and the sharp sting of metal fracturing air. He squinted through the blizzard, his breath catching in his chest, and saw her. A figure kneeling just outside the frame, half buried in the drift. She wasn't human. That was the first thing he noticed. Her skin shimmered, black and glossy like polished obsidian, catching the dim light from the pod in a way that made it look alive. Her frame was slight, draped in a tattered shawl that was more holes than fabric, soaked through and clinging to her like a second skin. Her arms were bare, wrapped around her chest as if she could squeeze the last of her warmth into staying put. Her fingers were blue at the tips, her legs marked with faint scars that looked too precise to be accidental, like restraint bands or medical cuffs. Long silver hair, wet and tangled, stuck to her face, and her head was bowed against the wind. In one trembling hand, she clutched a scrap of insulation fabric, torn from some supply crate. Elias leaned closer, the cold biting his face, and saw two words scrawled in smudged ink: "Heat me." He froze, not from the cold, but from the sheer weight of the moment. Everything about her screamed trouble. She wasn't Korath with their angular bones and bioluminescent veins. She wasn't Cylon with their scaled hides and thermal tolerance. She wasn't anything he could name, and that was bad enough. Grid 7D wasn't a place for unregistered species to just show up. The station's grid tracked everything: heat, water, food, air. If she was here, she was either lost, desperate, or running from something that could burn them both. Her eyes lifted, violet and faintly glowing like the afterimage of a star in a dark scope. They met his, not pleading, not scared, just waiting. Elias's hand tightened on the hatch frame. He could close it, seal her out, let the storm take her. Nobody would know, nobody would care. His pod's logs were clean, his metrics filed, his life invisible. But those eyes, damn them, they didn't blink. They just watched, and he felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. "Come in," he muttered, stepping aside. His voice was rough, unused for weeks. She tried to move, her body tilting forward, but her legs buckled. She collapsed into him, heavier than she looked, her frame small but dense, like her bones were made of something denser than calcium. Her skin was ice cold, not just chilly but dangerous, the kind of cold that could stop a heart if you weren't careful. Elias caught her, staggering under the impact, her cheek brushing his collarbone through his jumpsuit. For a second he just stood there, holding her, the storm screaming behind them. Then he kicked into gear. He dragged her fully inside, turned, and slammed the hatch shut. The pressure seal hissed, locking the cold out and the quiet in. The pod's heater core hummed, struggling to compensate for the sudden influx of frozen air. She crumpled to the floor, still trembling, the soaked shawl clinging to her hips and thighs, a puddle of meltwater spreading beneath her. Elias moved fast, grabbing a thermal tarp from the utility rack, a vac-sealed sheet he'd scavenged from a supply drop. He tore it open and wrapped it around her, tucking it under her arms to cover as much as possible. Her silver hair was plastered to her neck, her lips cracked and blue, but she hadn't passed out, that was something. He crouched beside her, leaning her carefully against the wall panel. "Can you hear me?" he asked, keeping his voice low like he was talking to a skittish drone. "Can you blink?" Her eyelids fluttered once, then twice. Okay, he thought, she's not gone. He stood, crossed to the sync unit, and activated the warm line. It sputtered, unused for days, but a thin trickle of steaming water came through. He soaked a cloth, folded it, and returned. "I'm going to touch your face now," he said, giving her a heads up. No response, but she didn't flinch when he pressed the cloth to her cheek, wiping gently along her jaw. The heat made her twitch, a small rasp of breath catching in her chest. He moved the cloth down her neck, checking her arms, her hands. Her nails were cracked, skin raw, and there were bruises on her inner forearms, too symmetrical to be random. Restraints, he thought. Someone had held her down, and not gently. He didn't ask, not yet. The pod's air grew thick with warmth, the heater core kicking into override. That was going to spike his usage, and he'd have to deal with it later. For now, he focused on her. Her eyes were open, watching him, no fear, just intensity. She hadn't looked away since he touched her. Elias sat back on his heels, one hand on the tarp to keep it in place, the other ready in case she collapsed again. He could feel his own pulse, steady but loud in his ears. The note was still on the floor, damp but readable. He picked it up, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his jumpsuit pocket. Not trash, not yet. The pod stayed quiet, the only sounds the hum of the heater and the faint hiss of the storm outside. Elias didn't move for a long time, just sat there watching her breathe. Her chest rose and fell, slow but steady, the obsidian sheen of her skin starting to flush at the edges where the tarp didn't cover. She was warming up, but not enough. He wasn't sure if she could speak, wasn't sure if she'd ever speak, but those violet eyes told him she was aware, processing, maybe even judging. He ran a hand through his hair, short and streaked with gray from years of stress and bad air. Why her? Why now? Why his door? He didn't believe in fate, didn't believe in much of anything beyond what he could fix with a wrench. But that note, "Heat me," didn't feel random. It felt like a question, and he'd answered it by letting her in. Now she was here, and whatever came next, she was his problem. Elias Varn wasn't a people person, never had been. He'd spent his best years talking to thermal relays and diagnostic panels, which had the decency to beep or blink when they had something to say. People, on the other hand, were messy, unpredictable, and usually wanted something you couldn't fix with a wrench. So when the woman with obsidian skin and violet eyes collapsed into his pod, he wasn't exactly thrilled about the conversational prospects. She hadn't spoken a word since he dragged her in from the storm, and that was fine by him. Silence was his default setting. But those eyes, sharp and glowing faintly in the dim light of his salvaged strip, kept watching him, tracking every move like she was memorizing his habits. It wasn't fear, he decided. It wasn't even suspicion. It was something else, something deliberate, and it made the back of his neck prickle. He'd named her Syl, mostly because he needed something to call her that wasn't "Hey you" or "Not dead yet." She was still wrapped in the thermal tarp, propped against the wall of his pod in Grid 7D, the ascent of Nebula 4 where the air tasted like recycled despair, and the walls creaked under the weight of ice. The storm outside was still raging, a constant hiss of snow and ash against the hull, but inside, the heater core hummed, pushing the temperature to a level that didn't make your bones ache. Syl's skin wasn't blue at the edges anymore, though her lips were still cracked, and her silver hair clung to her neck in damp strands. Elias had managed to get her to drink a little water, warmed from the pod's stuttering recycler, and she'd taken a few bites of rehydrated protein paste, the kind that tasted like regret but kept you alive. Her hands were steadier now, gripping the metal spoon like it was a lifeline. She didn't flinch when he moved near her, didn't pull away, just watched him with that unnerving intensity. He'd asked if she could hear him, and she'd blinked twice, which he took as a yes. Beyond that, nothing. No name, no story, no hint of where she'd come from or why she'd knocked on his door with a scrap of insulation fabric scrawled with "Heat me." Elias wasn't one for mysteries. Mysteries were just problems you hadn't solved yet, and he liked his problems with clear inputs and outputs. But Syl was a variable he couldn't parse, and that made him twitchy. He sat at his workbench, pretending to fiddle with the plasma coil he'd been repairing when she showed up. The pod was small, maybe 10 meters square, with every surface cluttered. Tools, cables, a half-empty canister of nutrient paste steaming under a coil warmer. The light strip buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the insulated mat that kept the floor from freezing. The monitor on the wall blinked, showing the storm's stats. Minus 60 degrees C now, winds down to 130 clicks per hour. Better, but still deadly. Elias glanced at Syl, who was still sitting against the wall, the tarp pulled tight around her shoulders. Her shawl, that tattered translucent thing, was drying in a crumpled heap beside her, revealing more of her frame. She was slight but not frail, her arms and legs marked with faint scars, too precise to be random. Restraints, he thought again, like the kind used in medical bays or holding cells. Her ankles had the same marks, and her feet were bare, cracked from the cold. Whoever she was, she'd been through something, and it wasn't a friendly hike through Grid 7D. Elias's mind kept circling back to the note in his pocket. Heat me. 2 words, handwritten, smudged but deliberate. She'd had the strength to write it, to knock, to survive out there long enough to reach his pod. That meant she wasn't just some lost refugee. She'd chosen his door, or at least stumbled to it with purpose. He didn't like that thought. Purpose meant complications, and complications meant attention. And attention was the one thing he'd spent years avoiding. The pod's heater core let out a low groan, and the monitor flashed a warning. Power draw anomaly, 15% above baseline. Elias cursed under his breath. Nebula 4 grid tracked everything. Every watt, every liter, every breath you took if it moved a sensor. He'd been careful, kept his usage low, his reports clean, his existence invisible. But Syl was a heat sink, a living, breathing spike in his metrics. If he didn't cover it, the grid would flag his pod and someone would come sniffing. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. He stood, crossed to the auxiliary panel, and started rerouting the heater's draw through a backup cell he'd scavenged from a survey drone. It wasn't ideal. The cell was meant for short bursts, not sustained use, and it had drained faster than he liked. But it'd buy him a day, maybe 2, before the system noticed. His fingers moved fast across the touch keys, redirecting power, masking the spike. When he glanced back, Syl was watching him, her violet eyes locked on his hands. She wasn't just staring, she was analyzing like she understood what he was doing. That made him pause. If she knew enough to recognize grid manipulation, she wasn't some random drifter. He didn't ask, though. Questions could wait. Right now, she needed to not die. He returned to her, crouching to check the tarp. "You warm enough?" he asked. She didn't nod, didn't blink, just held his gaze. Okay, he thought, that's how we're playing it. He stood, grabbed another canister of protein paste from the food rack and slid it into the warmer coil. It hissed to life, the orange glow reflecting off Syl's skin, making it shimmer like liquid night. He didn't know what she was, not exactly. Not Korath, not Cylon, not any of the registered species that passed through Nebula 4 processing hubs. Her features were too smooth, her eyes too bright, her silence too deliberate. He'd worked with non-humans before, back when he was still climbing through the station's conduits. Most of them talked, or at least gestured in ways he could parse. Syl was different. She communicated in glances, in the way she tilted her head, in the way she didn't flinch when he moved closer. The paste beeped and he pulled it out, setting the canister between them on the mat. He handed her a spoon and she took it, her fingers brushing his for a split second. They were still cold, but not as bad as before. She dipped the spoon into the paste, took a small bite and chewed slowly, her eyes never leaving his. Elias sat back, exhaling through his nose. "You're not registered," he said, keeping his voice low like he was talking to the pod systems. Nobody registered would be out there in that storm. She didn't react, just kept eating, her movements precise. "If you're flagged, this pod's already on a scan list. If you're not, we've got a window before the grid notices the heat spike." Her hands paused just for a moment, then resumed. She understood him, no question. Elias leaned back against the workbench, rubbing his jaw. The stubble was rough under his fingers, a reminder he hadn't shaved in weeks. He wasn't sure what to do with her. Letting her in had been a reflex, a moment of stupidity or compassion, or whatever you called it when you ignored your better instincts. Now she was here, eating his food, burning his power, and watching him like he was the one who needed to explain himself. The monitor flashed again. Air filtration cycle exceeded forecast. Elias muttered another curse and tapped the panel to mute the alert. He'd have to delay the log upload, maybe reroute the filtration data through a secondary cache. It had cost him power, but he didn't have a choice. Syl finished the paste, setting the canister down with a soft clink. She pulled the tarp tighter around her shoulders, her silver hair catching the light as she shifted. Elias caught himself staring, not at her face but at the scars on her arms, the ones that looked like they'd been made by something mechanical, precise. He wanted to ask, wanted to know what she was running from, but her silence was a wall, and he wasn't sure he had the tools to climb it. Instead, he stood, moved to the sink, and refilled the cloth with warm water. He handed it to her, careful not to touch her this time. "Clean up if you want," he said. She took the cloth, her fingers steady now, and wiped her face, then her neck, moving with the same deliberate care she'd used with the spoon. Elias turned away, busying himself with the plasma coil, though he wasn't really working on it. His mind was on the grid, on the power draw, on the fact that he just invited a walking anomaly into his carefully invisible life. Syl didn't move from her spot, but he could feel her eyes on him, like a sensor scanning for weak points. He didn't know if she was dangerous, didn't know if someone was looking for her, didn't know if letting her in was the dumbest thing he'd ever done. But she was here, and for now that was the only fact that mattered. The pod stayed quiet, the heater's hum blending with the storm's distant hiss. Elias sat back at the workbench, his hands still, his mind racing. Syl's breathing was steadier now, her body less hunched, her skin less pale at the edges. She was alive, and he'd made that happen. Whether that was a win or a mistake, he'd find out soon enough. Elias Varn wasn't a detective, and he didn't play one in his spare time. His world was made of conduits, relays, and the kind of math that kept air breathable and heat flowing. But as he watched Syl move through his pod, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was a puzzle he was supposed to solve, even if he didn't have the manual. 3 days had passed since she'd collapsed through his hatch in Grid 7D, the frozen armpit of Nebula 4, and she still hadn't said a word. Her silence wasn't the empty kind, though. It was heavy, deliberate, like she was holding back a whole library of things she wasn't ready to share. Her violet eyes followed him, sharp and calculating, but they weren't cold anymore. They were curious, maybe even cautious, and that made Elias's skin itch in a way he couldn't quite explain. The pod was warmer now, the heater core chugging along on the backup cell he'd rigged to mask the power spike. The storm outside had calmed to a low growl, winds down to 90 clicks per hour, but the monitor still blinked with warnings. Water usage up 8%, filtration cycle off by 12%. Elias had rerouted the data through a secondary cache, buying another day before the grid started asking questions. He wasn't a genius, but he knew how to make a system look the other way, at least for a while. Syl, meanwhile, had started claiming the space in her own quiet way. She'd cleaned his workbench, which had been a chaos of tools, cables, and half-eaten protein paste canisters for years. Now the tools were lined up, the cables coiled, and the canisters stacked neatly on a shelf. She'd even taken a broken circuit probe and turned it into a comb, dragging it through her silver hair until it hung smooth and straight, tied back with a strip of insulation fabric she'd scavenged from his supply rack. She wore his spare work jacket, a faded gray thing that swallowed her slight frame, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The tattered shawl she'd arrived in was folded in a corner, still damp but no longer dripping. Elias watched her from the corner of his eye, pretending to fiddle with a diagnostic pad. She moved with purpose, every step measured, like someone who'd learned to make every action count. Her obsidian skin caught the light from the buzzing strip overhead, shimmering faintly as she knelt to wipe a smudge off the insulated mat. The scars on her arms and ankles were clearer now, thin and precise, like they'd been etched by a machine. Restraints. Elias was sure of it. Medical or correctional, he couldn't tell, but they weren't random. She'd been held somewhere and not for a friendly chat. He didn't ask about them. He wasn't sure he wanted the answers yet. The pod smelled different with her in it, less like coolant and burnt paste, more like the faint, clean scent of her skin after she'd used the recycler's warm water to wash. It was a small thing, but it made the space feel less like a bunker, and more like a place someone might actually live. Elias wasn't sure how he felt about that. He'd spent years making his life invisible, a ghost in the grid, and now here was this woman, this variable, rearranging his tools and breathing his air. He didn't hate it, but he didn't trust it either. The monitor pinged again, a soft chime that made him flinch. Another anomaly, heat output exceeding forecast. He muttered a curse and tapped the panel, rerouting the excess through a tertiary relay he'd patched together from a scrapped drone. It'd hold for another 12 hours, maybe, but the grid was getting nosy. Every extra watt Syl used, every sip of water, every degree of heat was a breadcrumb leading back to his pod. If the system flagged him, someone would come knocking, and it wouldn't be with a polite note. Elias glanced at Syl, who was now sitting cross-legged on the mat, her hands folded in her lap. She'd taken to sitting there when she wasn't cleaning or eating, like it was her designated spot. Her violet eyes flicked to the monitor, then back to him, and he swore she knew what the ping meant. She wasn't stupid, that much was clear. She'd survived a storm that should have killed her, made it to his door, and written a note that got her inside. That took brains, or at least instinct sharpened to a fine edge. He stood, grabbed a canister of protein paste from the rack, and slid it into the warmer coil. The orange glow lit up her face as she watched, her expression unreadable but attentive. He handed her the canister and a spoon, and she took them, her fingers brushing his for a moment longer than necessary. Her skin wasn't cold anymore, not like that first night, but it still sent a jolt through him, like touching a live wire. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving his, and Elias felt the weight of that gaze again. It wasn't just curiosity now. It was something closer to recognition, like she was starting to see him as more than a guy with a warm pod. He sat across from her, leaning against the workbench, and tried to focus on the diagnostic pad. The numbers weren't good. The backup cell was draining faster than he'd hoped, and the grid's algorithms were already sniffing around his data. He could delay the logs another day, maybe two, but after that he'd need a better fix, or a miracle. Syl finished eating and set the canister down with a soft clink. She pulled the jacket tighter around her, the sleeves slipping down to cover her hands. Elias noticed the scars again, peeking out from the cuffs, and his mind went back to the note in his pocket. "Heat me." He hadn't thrown it away, hadn't even unfolded it since that first night. It felt like a piece of her, a clue he wasn't ready to lose. He was about to say something, maybe ask her name or where she'd come from, when she stood, moving with that same deliberate grace. She crossed to the workbench, picked up a small metal chip from the clutter, and held it out to him. Elias frowned, taking it. It was a tag no bigger than a coin, its surface scorched and melted on one side. A serial number was faintly visible, but the tracking circuit was fried, deliberately so. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of it, and looked at her. "This yours?" he asked. She nodded, a single, slow dip of her head. Her eyes were steady, but there was a tightness in her jaw, like she was bracing for something. Elias flipped the tag again, his mind racing. This wasn't just an ID. It was a tracking chip, the kind used for prisoners or test subjects. Someone had wanted to know where she was, and she'd made damn sure they couldn't. "You burned it," he said, not a question. Another nod. He set the tag down on the workbench, careful not to let it clatter. "You're running from something, someone." She didn't nod this time, just looked at him, her violet eyes bright in the dim light. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Grid 2A, the labor camps, was the obvious guess. Nebula 4 had a reputation for chewing up unregistered workers, spitting them out when they weren't useful anymore. But Syl didn't look like a laborer. Her scars, her silence, the way she moved, it all pointed to something more controlled, more clinical. A lab, maybe. A holding cell. He didn't ask. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice low. "If you're not registered, we've got a little time. If you are, we're already screwed." She didn't flinch, didn't look away, just held his gaze. Then slowly her hand moved to her stomach, resting there for a moment, her fingers splaying across the fabric of the jacket. Elias's breath caught. The gesture was subtle, but he wasn't an idiot. There was a slight curve there, barely noticeable under the oversized jacket, but real. She wasn't just running for herself. "Okay," he said, his voice softer now. "Okay." He didn't know what else to say. The pod was quiet, the heater's hum blending with the faint whistle of the storm outside. Syl sat back down on the mat, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. Elias stayed where he was, the tag still on the workbench, its scorched surface catching the light. He didn't know what she'd escaped from, didn't know how she'd made it to his door, but he knew one thing. She was his responsibility now. And that meant keeping the grid's eyes off them for as long as he could. He stood, moved to the auxiliary panel, and started tweaking the filtration data, buying another few hours. Syl watched him, her eyes never leaving his hands, and for the first time, Elias wondered if she was as much a puzzle to herself as she was to him. Elias Varn wasn't a fan of tight spots, literal or metaphorical. He'd spent his career crawling through Nebula 4 conduits, squeezing past pipes hot enough to cook his skin if he misjudged a turn, so he knew how to handle pressure. But the kind of pressure building in his pod now wasn't the kind you fixed with a wrench or a rerouted relay. It was the kind that came from a grid that never slept, always watching, always counting every watt and drop you used. 5 days into Syl's stay in his decommissioned storage pod in Grid 7D, the frozen backside of the orbital station, Elias was starting to feel the walls closing in. Not the actual walls, though they weren't exactly roomy, but the invisible ones made of data pings and system alerts. The pod's monitor had been throwing tantrums all morning. Water usage up 10%, heat draw exceeding baseline by 18%, air filtration cycling too fast. Elias had been playing whack-a-mole with the grid, rerouting power through a scavenged drone battery, fudging filtration logs, and delaying uploads to the central system. It was a game he'd played before, keeping his existence off the radar, but Syl was a variable he hadn't accounted for. She was a living, breathing power spike, and every second she stayed in his pod was another tick on a countdown he couldn't see the end of. Syl, for her part, seemed to understand the stakes without him saying a word. Her violet eyes, sharp and glowing faintly in the pod's dim light, followed his every move as he tapped at the auxiliary panel, muttering curses under his breath. She'd settled into the space like she'd been there for years, not days. The workbench was spotless now, tools lined up like soldiers, cables coiled tight, and the half-eaten canisters of protein paste stacked neatly on a shelf. She'd taken to wearing his spare work jacket, the gray fabric hanging loose on her slight frame, sleeves rolled up to her elbows to show the faint scars on her forearms. Her silver hair was tied back with a strip of insulation fabric, and she turned a broken circuit probe into a comb, dragging it through her locks until they shimmered like liquid metal. She moved with a kind of deliberate grace, every action calculated, like she'd learned to survive by making every gesture count. Elias couldn't help but watch her, even when he pretended he wasn't. The pod smelled different now, less like coolant and burnt paste, more like the clean, faintly metallic scent of her skin after she washed with the recycler's warm water. It wasn't a bad change, but it was a change, and Elias didn't trust changes. He'd built his life on predictability, on being a ghost in Nebula 4 grid, and Syl was rewriting his script without saying a damn word. She hadn't spoken since she'd arrived, not a single syllable, but her silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, conveyed in the tilt of her head, the way she watched him, the way she didn't flinch when he got close. Those violet eyes were a language of their own, and Elias was starting to learn the grammar. He was at the workbench, pretending to calibrate a thermal sensor when the monitor pinged again. A new alert, anomalous water draw detected, review advised. Elias swore, louder this time, and crossed to the panel in 2 strides. He tapped the keys, redirecting the data through a tertiary cache he'd rigged from a scrapped relay unit. It'd buy him another 6 hours, maybe, but the grid was getting pushy. Every alert was a finger tapping on his shoulder, reminding him that the system didn't like surprises any more than he did. Syl was sitting on the insulated mat, her usual spot, knees pulled up and the jacket draped over her like a cloak. She watched him work, her gaze steady, and Elias could tell she knew what the pings meant. She wasn't clueless. She'd survived a storm that should have killed her, made it to his door with a note that got her inside. That took smarts, or at least the kind of instinct that kept you alive when the odds said you shouldn't be. He finished tweaking the panel and turned to her, leaning against the workbench. "You know this can't last, right?" he said, keeping his voice low like he was talking to the pod itself. "The grid's going to notice you're here. Sooner or later, it always does." Syl didn't nod, didn't blink, just held his gaze. Her hand rested on her stomach, a subtle gesture that hit Elias like a punch. The curve was there, faint but real under the oversized jacket. She wasn't just running for herself, and that made everything more complicated. He'd seen the scorched ID tag she'd given him, its tracking circuit fried on purpose. She'd escaped something, maybe the labor camps in Grid 2A, maybe something worse. Whatever it wasn't the kind of thing you walked away from without someone noticing. Elias rubbed his jaw, the stubble rough under his fingers. He wasn't a hero, wasn't built for it. He was just a guy who fixed things, who kept the air flowing and the heat on. But Syl was here, and those violet eyes were looking at him like he was more than that, and damn if that didn't make him want to live up to it. He crossed to the food rack, grabbed a canister of protein paste, and slid it into the warmer coil. The orange glow lit up Syl's face as she watched, her expression calm but attentive. He handed her the canister and a spoon, and she took them, her fingers brushing his again. This time the touch lingered just a fraction of a second longer, warm and deliberate. Elias felt a jolt, not unlike the static shocks he'd gotten from faulty conduits, but softer, more human. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving his, and he sat across from her, trying to ignore the way his pulse ticked up. The pod was quiet, the heater's hum blending with the storm's faint whistle outside. Elias's mind was anything but quiet. He kept thinking about that tag, about the scars, about the way she'd written "Heat me" like it was the only thing she could trust to say. He wanted to ask her who she was, what she was running from, but every time he opened his mouth, her silence stopped him. It wasn't just that she didn't speak. It was that she didn't need to. Her actions said enough. The way she cleaned his pod, the way she watched him work, the way she didn't pull away when he got close. He was starting to understand her, or at least he thought he was, and that scared him more than the grid's alerts. The monitor pinged again, a sharp chime that made him flinch. Excess heat draw. Immediate review required. Elias swore under his breath and moved to the panel, his fingers flying across the keys. He rerouted the heater's output through a secondary relay, a trick he'd learned back when he was still climbing through the station's guts. It had masked the spike for another few hours, but he was running out of tricks. The grid was like a dog with a bone, and it wasn't going to let go. Syl finished eating and set the canister down with a soft clink. She stood, moving to the workbench, and picked up a small tool, a broken solder node she'd been using to comb her hair. She ran it through her silver locks, slow and deliberate, and Elias caught himself watching. Her movements were hypnotic, not because they were graceful, but because they were so damn purposeful. She wasn't just surviving, she was claiming the space, making it hers. He didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it was definitely a thing. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're not making this easy," he said, half to her, half to himself. "I've got enough problems without the grid sniffing around." Syl paused, the solder node still in her hair, and looked at him. Her violet eyes were soft now, not sharp, and for the first time Elias saw something like trust in them. She set the node down and moved closer, not fast, not slow, just steady. She sat beside him on the mat, her shoulder brushing his arm, and the contact was enough to make him forget the monitor for a second. Her hand found his, her fingers warm and firm, and she pressed her forehead against his, a gesture that felt like a conversation without words. Elias didn't move, just breathed, letting the moment stretch. The pod was warm, too warm, and the grid was closing in, but right now, with her forehead against his, none of that mattered. She was here, and she was real, and he'd be damned if he let the system take that away. Elias Varn had never been one for grand gestures. His life in Grid 7D, the frostbitten backwater of Nebula 4, was built on small, practical choices. Patch a conduit, reroute a relay, file a report that didn't raise eyebrows. Big decisions, the kind that changed everything, were for people with more ambition or less sense than he had. But as he stared at the monitor in his pod, its red alert pulsing like a heartbeat, he knew he was standing at the edge of one of those decisions, and there was no way to wiggle out of it. The grid had finally caught up with him. 7 days after Syl, the silent woman with obsidian skin and violet eyes, had stumbled through his hatch, the system was done playing nice. The latest alert was a screamer. Critical power anomaly detected. Immediate audit required. Elias had been dodging the grid, snooping for days, rerouting heat through a scavenged drone battery, fudging water logs, and delaying uploads with every trick he'd learned in his years as a conduit engineer. But the grid wasn't stupid. It was a machine, relentless and patient, and it knew something was off. Every watt Syl used, every liter of water, every breath she took was a data point, and now those points were forming a picture that screamed trouble. Elias stood at the auxiliary panel, his fingers hovering over the touch keys, but he knew he was out of moves. The pod was warm, too warm, the heater core humming on its last legs as it burned through the backup cell. The air smelled of recycled coolant and the faint, clean scent of Syl's skin, a reminder that she wasn't just a variable in his equations anymore. She was real, sitting on the insulated mat that had become her spot, her silver hair tied back with a strip of insulation fabric, his oversized work jacket draped over her like a shield. Her violet eyes watched him, steady and unblinking, and Elias could tell she knew the score. She hadn't spoken a word since she'd arrived, but her silence was louder than any alarm. She understood the grid was closing in, understood what it meant, and she was waiting for him to do something about it. Elias wasn't sure he had it in him. He wasn't a hero, wasn't built for saving people. He was just a guy who fixed things, who kept the air flowing and the heat on. But Syl wasn't just a thing to fix. She was a person, or whatever passed for a person, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed like stars. And that tag she'd given him, the scorched ID chip with its fried tracking circuit, told him she was running from something bad. Maybe the labor camps in Grid 2A, maybe something worse. The scars on her arms and ankles, precise and mechanical, backed up that story. And then there was her hand, resting on her stomach, the subtle curve that said she wasn't running alone. That changed everything. Elias turned from the panel, rubbing his jaw, the stubble rough under his fingers. The pod was small, cluttered with tools, cables, and canisters of protein paste, but it felt smaller now, like the walls were pressing in with every ping from the monitor. Syl stood, moving with that deliberate grace that made every step look like a choice, and crossed to the workbench. She picked up the broken circuit probe she'd been using as a comb, running it through her hair, slow and steady. Elias watched, caught by the way her silver strands caught the light from the buzzing strip overhead. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living, claiming the space, making it hers. And that made what he had to say next even harder. "We can't stay," he said, his voice low like he was talking to the pod systems. "The grid's got us in its sights. Another day, maybe two, and someone's going to come knocking, and it won't be with a note." Syl paused, the probe still in her hair, and looked at him. Her violet eyes were soft, not sharp, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw trust in them. She set the probe down and moved closer, sitting beside him on the mat, her shoulder brushing his arm. The contact was warm, grounding, and it made his pulse tick up despite himself. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and kept talking. "There's a place we can go. A relay outpost 9 clicks west. It's off the grid, no sensors, no logs. Abandoned years ago when the thermal lines shifted. It's not much, but it's hidden. We can hole up there, figure out what's next. Syl didn't nod, didn't blink, just held his gaze. Then slowly she reached for his hand, her fingers warm and firm, and pressed her forehead against his. It wasn't a hug, wasn't a kiss, but it was an answer, a wordless agreement that hit Elias like a jolt from a live conduit. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hand tightening around hers. Okay, he thought. Okay. They were doing this. The pod was quiet, the heater's hum blending with the storm's faint whistle outside. Elias stood, moving to the supply rack, and started pulling together what they'd need. A portable heat cell, scavenged from a survey crawler, enough to keep them warm for a week. A handful of nutrient bars, the kind that tasted like cardboard but kept you moving. A grid compass, its display cracked but functional, tethered to his wrist for the trek. He packed it all into a miner's satchel, a battered thing he'd found in the relay hub's ruins, and locked it beside the hatch. Syl watched, her eyes tracking his every move, but she didn't help. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough, a reminder of why he was doing this. Elias turned to the auxiliary panel, his fingers flying across the keys as he started dismantling the pod's tracker. The grid couldn't follow them if it didn't know they'd left. He pulled the main circuit board, a palm-sized slab of silicon and copper, and crushed it under his boot, the crunch satisfying in a way he hadn't expected. The fragments went into the recycler, one piece at a time, until there was nothing left to trace. He moved to the workbench, grabbing a plasma torch, and started melting the pod's ID tags, the ones embedded in the walls. It was overkill, maybe, but Elias wasn't taking chances. The grid had eyes everywhere, and he wanted them blind. Syl stood now, moving to the sink unit, and soaked a cloth in warm water. She wiped her face, her neck, her arms, the scars catching the light as she moved. Elias glanced at her, caught by the way she carried herself, like every action was a statement. She'd stuffed his old boots with insulation fabric to make them fit, the laces tied tight around her ankles. Her silver hair was tied back, her violet eyes steady, and she looked ready, not just to survive, but to fight for it. Elias set the torch down and crossed to her, standing close enough to feel the warmth of her body through the jacket. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice softer than he meant it to be. "It's not going to be easy out there. Cold, dark, and the grid's not the only thing we've got to worry about." Syl looked at him, her eyes searching his, and then she leaned forward, her forehead pressing against his again. Her hands found his, gripping them tight, and Elias felt the weight of her answer. She wasn't just sure, she was committed. He nodded, a small movement, and stepped back, grabbing the satchel. The pod's monitor pinged one last time, a final warning that Elias ignored. He moved to the hatch, his hand on the pressure seal, and looked at Syl. She stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his, her violet eyes bright in the dim light. The storm outside was waiting, cold and cruel, but they were ready. Elias hit the switch, and the seal hissed, the hatch sliding open to reveal a wall of snow and ash. The cold hit like a fist, but Syl didn't flinch, and neither did he. They stepped out together, the satchel slung over his shoulder, her hand gripping the strap of his pack. The grid could chase them, but it wouldn't catch them. Not yet. Elias Varn had never been a fan of heroics, mostly because they usually ended with someone getting frostbite or a plasma burn. But as he trudged through the howling storm in Grid 7D, the frozen nowhere of Nebula 4, with Syl gripping the strap of his pack like a lifeline, he was starting to feel like he'd stumbled into a story he hadn't signed up for. The cold was a living thing, clawing at his face, seeping through his thermal jacket, and turning every breath into a sharp, brittle ache. The monitor on his wrist, a cracked grid compass tethered by a frayed cord, blinked faintly through the snow. -60°C, winds at 110 clicks per hour, visibility less than 5 meters. The storm wasn't as bad as the one that had brought Syl to his door, but it wasn't exactly a picnic either. Elias led the way, his boots crunching through the crust of ice and ash, the miner's satchel heavy on his shoulder. Inside were the essentials: a portable heat cell, a handful of nutrient bars, and a few tools he'd grabbed on instinct. Syl followed close, her steps deliberate despite the oversized boots she'd stuffed with insulation fabric to make them fit. Her silver hair was tucked under the hood of his spare jacket, but strands kept escaping, whipping in the wind like threads of light. Her violet eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, stayed fixed on his back, and Elias could feel her presence, steady and unyielding, even as the storm tried to tear them apart. He told her they were headed for an abandoned relay outpost 9 clicks west, a rusted husk off the grid's sensors, where they could hole up and figure out their next move. It was a long shot, but staying in the pod wasn't an option. The grid had been screaming about power anomalies, water spikes, and filtration errors, and Elias had run out of tricks to keep it quiet. He'd smashed the pod's tracker, melted the ID tags, and left nothing for the system to trace. But that didn't mean they were safe. The grid had a long memory, and Nebula 4 wasn't kind to ghosts who tried to slip its leash. Elias checked the compass every 20 meters, squinting through the snow to keep them on course. The terrain was a nightmare, all jagged ice ridges and drifts that hid crevices deep enough to swallow a drone. He'd navigated Grid 7D before, back when he was still a conduit engineer crawling through the station's guts, but never in a storm like this and never with someone else to worry about. Syl was holding up better than he'd expected. Her slight frame didn't waver, even when the wind gusted hard enough to make Elias stumble. Her hand stayed on his pack, a constant pressure that kept him grounded, reminded him why he was out here freezing his ass off. He glanced back, catching her eyes through the swirl of snow. They were sharp, focused, not a hint of panic. She was tougher than she looked, and she looked plenty tough, scars and all. The thought made him pause just for a second before he pushed forward, his boots sinking deeper into the drift. The scars on her arms and ankles, those precise, mechanical marks, kept circling in his mind. She'd been held somewhere, restrained, maybe experimented on. The scorched ID tag she'd given him was proof she'd burned her past to ash, but it didn't tell him what she was running from. Grid 2A's labor camps were the easy guess, but something about her, the way she moved, the way she watched him, said it was more complicated than that. And then there was her hand resting on her stomach, the subtle curve that told him she wasn't alone in this. That was the part that kept him moving, kept him checking the compass, kept him ignoring the cold that was starting to numb his fingers. They'd been walking for hours, maybe 3, maybe 4, when the terrain started to shift. The ice ridges gave way to flatter ground, the ash drifts thinning as they neared the outpost's coordinates. Elias's legs burned, his lungs ached, and the satchel felt like it was trying to pull him into the ground, but he didn't stop. Syl didn't either. Her grip on his pack never faltered, her steps matching his even when he slowed to check the compass. He wanted to tell her to rest, to take it easy, but one look at her face told him that wasn't an option. She wasn't just following him. She was with him every step, every breath. The outpost appeared through the snow like a ghost, a hulking shadow of rusted conduits and sagging walls. It was smaller than Elias remembered, maybe 20 meters wide, its frame half buried under a drift. The relay hub had been abandoned years ago when the thermal lines shifted, leaving it useless to the grid and invisible to its sensors. Perfect for two people who didn't want to be found. Elias stopped at the main hatch, a slab of alloy pitted with rust and ice. He dropped the satchel, his shoulder screaming in relief, and pulled a plasma torch from his belt. The lock was frozen, its mechanism probably shot, but Elias wasn't in the mood to negotiate. He fired up the torch, the blue flame hissing against the cold, and cut through the lock in a shower of sparks. The hatch groaned, protesting as he shoved it open, revealing a dark, dry interior that smelled of old oil and metal dust. He stepped inside, motioning for Syl to follow, and she did, her boots scuffing the floor as she crossed the threshold. The air inside was stale but not frozen, a small mercy. Elias set the satchel down and pulled out the portable heat cell, a compact unit no bigger than a fist. He plugged it into a wall port, praying the outpost's wiring wasn't completely fried. The cell hummed to life, a soft amber glow spreading across the room, followed by a faint wave of warmth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the edge off the cold. Syl stood near the hatch, her violet eyes scanning the space. Rusted conduits snaking along the walls, a broken console in one corner, a pile of insulation scraps in another. She didn't move, just watched, her hand still resting on her stomach. Elias crouched by the heat cell, checking its output, and glanced at her. "We're off the grid here," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "No sensors, no logs. We're invisible, at least for now." Syl's eyes met his, and for the first time he saw something like relief in them, a softening at the edges. She stepped closer, her boots quiet on the floor, and sank down beside him, her shoulder brushing his. The contact was warm, deliberate, and Elias felt his pulse tick up, not from fear but from something he couldn't name. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. Her presence was enough, a silent promise that they were in this together. Elias pulled the satchel closer, digging out a nutrient bar and handing it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and unwrapped it with the same careful precision she used for everything. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving his, and Elias found himself watching her, caught by the way her silver hair caught the amber light. The outpost was a wreck, all rust and dust, but with her here it felt less like a ruin and more like a start. He leaned back against the wall, the heat cell's warmth seeping into his bones, and let out a breath. The storm outside was still howling, but inside they were safe, or as safe as you could be when you were running from a system that never forgot. Elias didn't know what came next, didn't know if the outpost would hold, didn't know if the grid would find them. But Syl was here, her shoulder against his, her violet eyes steady, and that was enough to keep him going. He reached into the satchel, pulled out another nutrient bar, and unwrapped it, the crinkle of the wrapper loud in the quiet. They ate in silence, the heat cell humming, the storm a distant roar. Elias glanced at Syl, her face half-lit by the amber glow, and felt something shift inside him. He wasn't a hero, wasn't built for it, but he was starting to think he could be something else, something more for her. Elias Varn wasn't much for sentimentality, mostly because it didn't fix anything. Leaky conduits, fried relays, power spikes, those were problems you could solve with a tool in hand and a clear head. Feelings, on the other hand, were like trying to weld in a vacuum, messy, unpredictable, and likely to get you burned. But as he sat in the abandoned relay outpost, 9 clicks west of his old pod in Grid 7D, the frozen nowhere of Nebula 4. With Syl's shoulder brushing his, he was starting to think feelings might be harder to avoid than he'd hoped. The outpost was a rust bucket, a sagging shell of alloy and insulation that hadn't seen a maintenance crew in a decade, but it was theirs. The portable heat cell hummed softly in the corner, casting an amber glow across the room, warming the air enough to keep their breath from fogging. The storm outside was a distant grumble now, winds down to 70 clicks per hour, the snow and ash settling into drifts that buried the outpost's tracks. They were off the grid, invisible to Nebula 4 sensors, and for the first time in days, Elias felt like he could breathe without the grid's eyes boring into his back. Syl, the woman with obsidian skin and violet eyes, was making herself at home in her quiet, deliberate way. She'd already claimed a corner of the outpost, a patch of floor near the heat cell where she'd arranged their meager supplies. Nutrient bars stacked in neat rows, a folded thermal tarp, a cracked water canister she'd cleaned with recycler fluid. Her silver hair was tied back with a strip of insulation fabric, and she still wore his oversized work jacket, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing the faint scars that told a story she hadn't shared. She moved with purpose, wiping down the rusted console in the corner, sorting through a pile of insulation scraps to make a makeshift mat. Elias watched her from the other side of the room, leaning against a conduit pipe he'd been checking for leaks. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something, turning this wreck into a place that felt almost livable. It was unsettling how easily she'd slipped into his life, like a gear clicking into place. He wasn't sure he liked it, but he didn't hate it either. The outpost was bigger than his pod, maybe 15 meters across, with walls of reinforced alloy and a ceiling that sagged under the weight of ice. The air smelled of old oil and dust, but the heat cell was doing its job, pushing back the cold that seeped through the cracks. Elias had spent the first day reinforcing the hatch, welding a scavenged plate over the lock to keep the storm out. He'd checked the wiring, patched a few frayed lines, and rigged the heat cell to a secondary power cache he'd found buried under the console. It wasn't perfect, but it'd hold, at least until they figured out what came next. Syl, meanwhile, had taken to the space like she'd been born for it. She'd found a broken tool, a jagged piece of alloy that might have been part of a relay arm, and used it to scrape rust off the walls, clearing a patch for them to sit. She'd even started humming, a soft, low sound that barely carried over the heat cell's hum. It was the first noise she'd made, and it hit Elias like a static shock. He'd gotten used to her silence, the way it filled the room with meaning without words, but the humming was different. It was alive, unguarded, and it made the outpost feel less like a hideout and more like a home. Elias wasn't sure what to do with that. He was at the console, pretending to run diagnostics, when Syl approached, her boots scuffing softly on the floor. She held out a nutrient bar, unwrapped and split in half, her violet eyes steady as she offered it. Elias took it, their fingers brushing, and the warmth of her skin was a reminder of how far she'd come from that frozen figure who'd collapsed through his hatch. "Thanks," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She didn't nod, didn't smile, just sat beside him on the makeshift mat, her shoulder close enough to feel her heat through the jacket. They ate in silence, the nutrient bar tasting like cardboard and regret, but it was fuel and they needed it. The outpost was safe for now, but safe didn't mean permanent. The grid might not see them here, but Nebula 4 was a machine that didn't forget, and Elias knew they were living on borrowed time. He glanced at Syl, her silver hair catching the amber light, and thought about the scorched ID tag she'd given him. It was still in his pocket, a weight he couldn't ignore. She'd burned her past, fried the chip to keep someone from tracking her, but that didn't mean they weren't looking. The scars on her arms, her ankles, the subtle curve of her stomach, they all pointed to a story that wasn't over. Elias wasn't a detective, but he wasn't stupid either. She'd escaped something, maybe Grid 2A's labor camps, maybe a lab where they did things that left marks like those. And she wasn't running alone. That was the part that kept him up at night, the part that made him check the heat cell's output twice an hour, the part that made him want to keep her safe even when he didn't know how. The console pinged, a soft chime that made Elias flinch. It wasn't the grid, just a diagnostic alert, power levels stable, heat output steady. He let out a breath, leaning back against the wall, and Syl shifted closer, her shoulder pressing against his. The contact was deliberate, not accidental, and it sent a jolt through him, not unlike the static shocks he'd gotten from faulty conduits. He didn't pull away, didn't want to. Her presence was a constant now, a tether that kept him grounded in a way he hadn't expected. He'd spent years alone, invisible, a ghost in the grid, but with Syl here, he was starting to feel like he existed again. She finished her half of the nutrient bar and set the wrapper down, folding it neatly before tucking it into the stack of supplies. Then she turned to him, her violet eyes soft in the amber light, and reached for his hand. Her fingers were warm, firm, and she guided his hand to her stomach, pressing it gently against the curve. Elias froze, his breath catching as he felt the faint movement beneath her skin, a flutter that wasn't just hers. It was real, undeniable, and it hit him like a plasma burn. He looked at her, their eyes meeting, and for the first time he saw something like hope in her gaze. No words, no explanations, just that quiet connection, stronger than any alert from the grid. Elias didn't move his hand, didn't want to break the moment. The outpost was quiet, the heat cells hum blending with Syl's soft humming, a melody that didn't need words to carry meaning. He thought about the pod, the grid, the life he'd left behind. He'd burned his own bridges in a way, smashing the tracker and melting the tags to keep them hidden. But this moment with Syl felt like building something new. The scars, the tag, the silence. They were pieces of a puzzle he didn't have all the parts for, but he was starting to think he didn't need to solve it to know it mattered. He leaned back, his hand still on her stomach, and let the warmth of the outpost settle into his bones. The storm outside was a distant memory, the grid sensors blind to their presence. They were safe for now, and that was enough. Syl's humming grew softer, fading into the quiet, and Elias closed his eyes, letting her presence anchor him. He wasn't a hero, wasn't built for it, but he was here, and so was she, and together they were carving out something that felt like a beginning. The heat cell glowed, the outpost held, and for the first time in years, Elias Varn felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Elias Varn had never been one for settling down, not in the traditional sense anyway. His version of home was a decommissioned storage pod in Grid 7D, a frozen corner of Nebula 4 where the air smelled like coolant and the walls groaned under the weight of ice. But now, weeks into their stay at the abandoned relay outpost, 9 clicks west of his old life, he was starting to see what home might mean when you weren't alone. The outpost was a rust bucket, a crumbling shell of alloy and insulation that looked like it might collapse under a strong breeze, but it was holding, and so were they. Syl, the woman with obsidian skin and violet eyes, had turned the place into something more than a hideout. She'd arranged their supplies with a precision that bordered on obsessive. Nutrient bars stacked in perfect rows, water canisters lined up against the wall, insulation scraps folded into a makeshift bed. She still wore his oversized work jacket, the sleeves rolled up to show the scars on her forearms, and her silver hair was tied back with a strip of fabric she'd scavenged from the outpost's debris. The portable heat cell hummed in the corner, its amber glow casting long shadows across the rusted conduits, keeping the cold at bay. The storm outside had died down to a low hum, winds barely nudging 50 clicks per hour, and the silence was almost unnerving after days of howling snow. Elias sat on the floor, his back against a reinforced wall, fiddling with a salvaged solar panel he'd found buried under the console. It was cracked, its output patchy, but he'd managed to hook it into the heat cell's grid, giving them a few extra hours of power each cycle. Syl was across the room, wiping down a section of the wall with a damp cloth, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was polishing a treasure instead of a rusted panel. She'd started humming again, a soft, wordless melody that filled the outpost with a warmth the heat cell couldn't match. It was a sound Elias hadn't known he needed until it was there, threading through the quiet like a pulse. He glanced at her, catching the way her silver hair caught the light, and felt a tug in his chest, something he didn't want to name. He wasn't built for this, for caring about someone else, but Syl was making it hard to stick to that script. She'd been with him for weeks now, silent but present, her violet eyes always watching, always understanding more than she let on. The scars, the scorched ID tag, the subtle curve of her stomach, they told a story of escape, of survival, and Elias was starting to realize he was part of it, whether he'd signed up for it or not. He set the solar panel down, rubbing his hands on his jumpsuit, and stood to check the heat cell's output. The numbers were steady, no spikes, no alerts. The outpost was off the grid, invisible to Nebula 4 sensors, and Elias had made damn sure it stayed that way. He'd rewired the console, stripped out any active circuits, and buried the outpost's old ID tags under a pile of ash outside. The grid was relentless, but it wasn't omniscient, and for now they were ghosts. Syl finished cleaning and sat on the makeshift bed, her hands resting on her knees. The curve of her stomach was more pronounced now, visible even under the oversized jacket, and Elias felt a jolt every time he noticed it. She wasn't just running for herself, and that fact was a weight he carried as much as she did. He crossed to the supply stack, grabbing a nutrient bar and splitting it in half. He handed her one piece, their fingers brushing, and she took it with a nod, her violet eyes soft in the amber light. They ate in silence, the hum of the heat cell blending with her faint humming, and Elias let himself relax just a little. The outpost wasn't much, but it was theirs, and it was starting to feel like something real. The quiet was broken by a faint whine from the console, a low-frequency buzz that made Elias's skin prickle. He stood, crossing to the panel in 3 strides, and checked the readouts. It wasn't a grid alert, thank whatever passed for luck out here, but a proximity sensor he'd rigged from scavenged parts. Something had passed overhead, close enough to trip the wire, probably a survey drone scanning for thermal leaks. Elias held his breath, watching the console, but no alerts followed. The drone hadn't seen them, hadn't logged their heat signature. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, and turned to Syl. She was watching him, her expression calm but alert, like she knew exactly what the buzz meant. "Just a drone," he said, keeping his voice low. Didn't catch us, we're still clear." She nodded, her eyes never leaving his, and Elias felt a flicker of pride. They'd made it this far, beaten the grid at its own game, and Syl was part of that. She wasn't just a passenger, she was a partner, even if she didn't say a word. He sat beside her on the mat, their shoulders touching, and felt the warmth of her body through the jacket. It was a small thing, but it grounded him, made the outpost feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a place they could stay. Syl shifted, her hand finding his, her fingers warm and steady. She guided his hand to her stomach, pressing it gently against the curve, and Elias felt the faint flutter of movement beneath her skin. It was real, undeniable, and it hit him like a static shock. He looked at her, their eyes meeting, and saw something new in her gaze, not just trust but a kind of quiet strength, like she was telling him they could do this together. Elias didn't pull away, didn't want to. The outpost was quiet, the heat cell's hum blending with Syl's soft humming, and for a moment he let himself believe they could stay like this, hidden from the grid, building something new. He thought about the pod, the life he'd left behind, the tracker he'd smashed to keep them safe. It had been a gamble, but it was worth it for her. Syl leaned into him, her shoulder pressing harder against his, and Elias felt his pulse tick up. He wasn't a romantic, wasn't built for soft moments, but this wasn't soft. It was solid, real, like the weight of her hand in his. He glanced at the console, checking the proximity sensor one more time, and saw nothing but static. They were still invisible, still safe, and that was enough for now. Syl's humming grew softer, fading into the quiet, and Elias let himself lean into her just a little. The outpost wasn't perfect, wasn't permanent, but it was theirs, and with Syl here, it was starting to feel like a life. He didn't know what came next, didn't know how long they could stay hidden, but he knew he'd do whatever it took to keep her safe. The heat cell glowed, the outpost held, and Elias Varn, for the first time in years, felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Elias Varn had spent most of his life dodging trouble, not because he was particularly good at it, but because trouble had a way of finding you when you lived in Grid 7D, the forgotten, frost-bitten corner of Nebula 4. He'd learned to keep his head down, his logs clean, and his pod off the radar, but trouble didn't always come in the form of a grid alert or a busted relay. Sometimes it came in the shape of a woman with obsidian skin and violet eyes, carrying a secret that could burn you both. Weeks into their stay at the abandoned relay outpost, 9 clicks west of his old life, Elias was starting to think Syl was the kind of trouble you didn't dodge. She was the kind you held onto, even when every instinct screamed to run. The outpost was holding up, its rusted walls and sagging ceiling a stubborn middle finger to the storms outside. The portable heat cell hummed in the corner, its amber glow painting the room in soft light, keeping the cold at bay. Syl had made the place hers, arranging nutrient bars in neat stacks, cleaning the dust off the console, and turning insulation scraps into a bed that was almost comfortable. Her silver hair was tied back with a strip of fabric, and she still wore his oversized work jacket, the sleeves rolled up to show the scars on her forearms, precise and mechanical, like she'd been marked by something that didn't care about her pain. Her stomach was rounder now, the curve unmistakable even under the jacket, and Elias felt a jolt every time he saw it, a reminder that she wasn't running alone. They'd built something here, a fragile kind of life, but it was theirs, and he'd be damned if he let the grid take it away. He was at the console, checking the proximity sensor he'd rigged from scavenged parts when it happened. A sharp, high-pitched whine cut through the outpost's quiet, not the soft ping of a routine scan, but a scream that said something was wrong. Elias was on his feet in a second, his heart kicking against his ribs as he tapped the console's keys. The readout was bad news, an anomalous heat signature, logged by a passing drone traced back to the outpost. The heat cell, reliable until now, had spiked, a brief flare in its output that was enough to trip the grid's sensors. Elias cursed under his breath, his fingers flying across the panel as he tried to scrub the data. He'd masked their presence before, rerouting power, burying logs, but this was different. The grid had a scent now, and it wasn't going to let go. Syl was beside him in an instant, her violet eyes locked on the console, her expression calm but alert. She didn't need to speak to understand what was happening. Her silence, that heavy, deliberate quiet she'd carried since the day she'd knocked on his door, was a language Elias was learning to read. She knew the grid was closing in, knew what it meant, and she was waiting for him to make a call. He turned to her, his voice low and rough. The heat cell glitched, sent a signal the grid caught. We've got hours, maybe a day, before it starts sniffing around. Syl's eyes didn't waver, but her hand moved to her stomach, a gesture that hit Elias like a punch. He rubbed his jaw. Elias Varn wasn't built for happy endings. His life in Grid 7D, the frozen, forgotten corner of Nebula 4, had been a series of fixes and workarounds, keeping conduits flowing and relays humming without ever expecting a pat on the back. Happy endings were for people who didn't know what it felt like to live one step ahead of a system that never blinked. But as he crouched in the dim glow of an ancient geothermal bunker, a relic of a long-dead research project buried deep in the ice, with Syl's steady breathing beside him, he was starting to think maybe endings weren't the point. Maybe it was about what you built along the way. The bunker was their new refuge, a cavernous space carved into the bedrock of Grid 7D, its walls lined with cracked insulation panels and rusted pipes that hadn't seen power in decades. They'd fled the relay outpost after a heat cell glitch had sent a signal to the grid, a careless flare that painted a target on their backs. The trek to the bunker had been brutal, a 6-hour slog through snow and ash, with winds cutting at 80 clicks per hour and temperatures that made Elias's bones ache. Syl had matched his pace, her violet eyes sharp despite the cold, her hand gripping his pack like a tether. Now, safe in the bunker's depths, they were off the grid again, hidden from Nebula 4 relentless sensors. The air smelled of damp stone and old metal, but the geothermal tap, a clunky relic Elias had coaxed back to life, hummed softly, pumping warmth into the space. Syl had already started making it theirs, arranging their supplies with her usual precision. Nutrient bars stacked neatly, water canisters lined up, insulation scraps folded into a bed that was more comfortable than it had any right to be. Her silver hair was tied back, her obsidian skin catching the faint light from the tap's control panel, and she still wore his oversized work jacket, the sleeves rolled up to show the scars that told a story she was finally starting to share. Elias was at the tap, checking its output when Syl approached, her steps quiet on the stone floor. She'd been different since the outpost, less silent, more present. The first word she'd spoken, "Thank you," back when the grid had caught their scent, had cracked something open, and now she was letting him in piece by piece. She stopped beside him, her shoulder brushing his, and handed him a nutrient bar split in half. He took it, their fingers touching, and the warmth of her skin was a reminder of how far they'd come from that frozen night when she'd knocked on his pod's hatch. "Stable?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, the second time he'd heard it. Elias nodded, glancing at the tap's readouts. "For now. This thing's older than both of us, but it's holding. No grid signals, no drones. We're ghosts again." Sill's violet eyes met his, and he saw a flicker of something like relief, maybe even hope. She sat beside him on the bed of insulation scraps, her hand resting on her stomach, the curve now unmistakable. Elias felt a jolt, the same one he got every time he thought about the life she was carrying, the reason she'd run, the reason he was here. They ate in silence, the nutrient bar tasting like cardboard but doing its job, and the bunkers quiet wrapped around them, broken only by the hum of the geothermal tap. Sill's presence was a constant now, a weight that anchored him, and Elias was starting to realize he didn't mind it. He'd spent years alone, a ghost in the grid, but with her here, he felt like he was more than just a set of clean logs and patched relays. She was rewriting his script, and he was letting her. The bunker was bigger than the outpost, maybe 20 meters across, with a high ceiling and a maze of pipes that snaked into the dark. Elias had spent their first day reinforcing the entrance, welding a scavenged plate over the hatch to keep the cold out. He'd rigged a proximity sensor from spare parts, a crude alarm that would buzz if anything got too close. The geothermal tap was a miracle, a leftover from when Nebula 4 planners thought they could harness the planet's core for power. They'd been wrong, but the tap still worked, pulling just enough heat to keep the bunker livable. Sill had taken to the space like she'd been born for it, cleaning the dust off the walls, arranging their supplies, and humming that soft, wordless melody that filled the quiet with life. Elias watched her now, moving through the bunker with that deliberate grace, wiping down a panel with a damp cloth. Her humming was louder here, echoing off the stone, and it made the space feel less like a tomb and more like a home. He wasn't sure how she did it, how she turned a pile of scraps and rust into something that felt real, but he was grateful for it. He stood, crossing to the supply stack, and grabbed a water canister, checking its level. They had enough for a week, maybe two if they rationed, but he'd need to find a way to tap the bunker's old recycler soon. Sill followed him, her eyes tracking his hands, and when he turned, she was closer than he expected, her shoulder brushing his arm. "You're worried," she said, her voice low, the words careful but clear. Elias blinked, caught off guard. It was only her third sentence, and it hit like a spark. "Yeah," he admitted, setting the canister down. "This place is good, better than the outpost, but it's not forever. The grid's still out there, and it doesn't forget." Sill nodded, her hand moving to her stomach, and Elias saw the scars on her forearm catch the light, precise and mechanical, a reminder of what she'd escaped. "Grid 2A," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They made me. Tests, machines." She paused, her jaw tightening, and Elias waited, not pushing, not breathing. "I ran for this." Her hand pressed harder against her stomach, and Elias understood. The life inside her wasn't just a reason to run, it was a reason to fight. He reached for her hand, his fingers closing around hers, warm and steady. "They won't find you," he said, his voice rough but firm. "Not here, not with me." Sill's eyes met his, violet and glowing, and for the first time, he saw a smile, small but real, curve her lips. It was gone in a moment, but it was enough to make his chest ache. She leaned into him, her forehead pressing against his, and Elias felt the weight of her trust, heavier than any grid alert. They stayed like that, the bunker's quiet wrapping around them, the geothermal tap humming in the background. Elias thought about the pod, the outpost, the life he'd burned to keep her safe. He'd smashed trackers, melted tags, and walked through storms, all for this moment, this woman, this life they were building. He wasn't a hero, wasn't built for it, but he was starting to think he could be something else, something more for her. Syl pulled back, her hand still in his, and moved to the bed of insulation scraps, tugging him gently to sit beside her. She reached into the supply stack, pulling out a small bundle of fabric, and began folding it into a square, her movements careful and precise. Elias watched, realizing she was making a space for the child, a cradle of sorts from what little they had. "For them," she said, her voice soft but certain, and Elias felt his throat tighten. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and helped her fold the fabric, their hands working together in the dim light. The bunker was a relic, a forgotten piece of Nebula 4 past, but with Syl here, it was a beginning. The grid was out there, relentless and unblinking, but for now, they were hidden, safe in the warmth of their own making. Elias leaned back, his shoulder against hers, and let the quiet settle over him. Syl's humming started again, soft and steady, filling the bunker with a melody that didn't need words. He closed his eyes, her warmth anchoring him, and for the first time in years, Elias Varn felt like he was home. The dawn was still out there, shining through the ice, and they would meet it together, no matter what came next.